Thanks for joining today's Bright Horizons family webinar, Skill Building for Future Success. My name is LaDonna, and I'm excited to turn the presentation over to our speakers, but we have just a little bit of housekeeping that I'd like to go over with you right now. So first of all, I want to let everyone know that we are tweeting today's event using the hashtag BHParentWebinar. You can follow along right from the webinar console using the Twitter window. It's the box at the menu at the bottom of your screen with the Twitter icon. You can directly from there retweet anything to your followers, join in on the conversation. Again, the hashtag is BHParentWebinar. But if you're not on Twitter, no worries. Our chat room is open. You can access the chat by clicking the blue button with the chat bubbles from the menu at the bottom. So just use it to comment on the webinar, exchange ideas and tips with each other. If you have any questions, you can certainly put them in there as well. And just a couple of rules for the chat, because there are hundreds of you live today. We have to ask that you refrain from any profanity or trolling, and then, of course, to be respectful of each other's ideas. We also ask that, as much as possible, keep the chat on topic and try to avoid controversial statements. And unfortunately, violators of that will have to be blocked. If you need any technical help today, so if you can't see the slides, if you can't hear the audio, or you have some other issues, we have folks on standby. So you could just click the purple Q&A button to report your question or issue. And we do ask if you are having issues with audio or with the slides, your first line of defense is to just refresh your browser. That oftentimes works, but we do have folks who can help if you are still having any issues. Finally, we have a number of resources that you can access at any time during the webinar today from the resources window or the resources box. It's the one with the little clipboard. You can download a copy of the slides, which will also be emailed to you next week, along with a recording of the webinar, and we'll also email those resources to you as well. And actually, speaking of resources, I have a quick programming note. I want to let you know about a new parenting podcast from Bright Horizons. It's called Teach, Play, Love, Parenting Advice for the Early Years, and it features today's webinar host and Bright Horizons' very own early childhood expert, Rachel Robertson. This is a monthly podcast just for ages 0 to 6, and it's all about what you really need to know for your child's earliest and most important years for growth and development. You can feel free to subscribe wherever you get podcasts, or download episodes wherever you get your podcasts. And if you're on Apple, there's actually a link to the podcast right from the webinar menu. We're really excited about this podcast. And with that, I'm very pleased to turn it over to our host today, Rachel Robertson, Vice President of Education and Development at Bright Horizons.
Hi, everybody. I'm Rachel Robertson, as LaDonna said, and I've been in the early childhood field for 25 years and counting. I started as a toddler teacher all the way to my current role as Vice President of Education and Development for Bright Horizons. I'm also an author of education resource books and a few children's books, and I'm really delighted to introduce you to Stephanie Carlson, our guest today. Stephanie and I have a lot in common, but maybe most notably, we're both from Minnesota and connected to the University of Minnesota, where I'm a graduate, and Stephanie is current faculty. So welcome, Stephanie.
Thank you. Thanks, Rachel, and thanks to all of you for joining and to Bright Horizons for having me. So I'm a professor, as Rachel mentioned, at the University of Minnesota in the Institute of Child Development, and I study the development of executive function and self-regulation skills, and a lot of things that are related to that, as we'll discuss today. I'm also a co-founder and chief science officer at Reflection Sciences, which is a startup company out of the University of Minnesota that provides tools and services to educators about executive function development.
Great, yes, and Bright Horizons has worked with Stephanie in many ways, including with Reflection Sciences for the education resources. So it's great to have you, and let's get right to it. Today we are talking about the skills, 21st century skills, and that's a phrase we're hearing more and more to define that set of skills that children will need to be successful adults. I think this set of skills has really changed from what it used to be because the way we work and the way we will work in the future is really changing. So I've been hearing more and more discussion about that this set of skills is really important for school, work, and life in the future. Stephanie, can you just share a little bit more about how you define or what we mean by 21st century skills?
Sure. So these are essentially the skills that employers are looking for. If you were to look at or interview employers about, what are some of the skills that you would really want your staff to have in terms of what's predictive of success of any organization. And they would say things that, sure, the educational background is important, educational, achievement, which requires academic skills, but also these kind of non-academic skills are nevertheless very important as well. So things like collaboration and doing well with teamwork, being creative or innovative, and thinking critically, being able to engage in project learning. It's really rare in today's workplace that people work exclusively independently on projects. So you have to be able to manage conflict that inevitably arises in team situations. You have to be able to regulate your thoughts and your emotions, which can get heated in those contexts, and also show empathy for others. So these are sometimes called soft skills, but they also have a really clear and well-established brain basis, and that's called executive function.
Great. So as I'm listening to you share that list, I'm realizing and thinking, it's really a different list of skills than the good old 3 R's of reading, writing, and arithmetic that many of us grew up with. I know that this, just because you're reading this list and sharing these 21st century skills, it doesn't mean that traditional academic skills aren't still important. But I think my takeaway from all of our conversations and the research I've read is that we all need to broaden our focus to be more about intellectual development as a whole that includes academics but isn't only academics, and also think about how intellectual or cognitive development and skills and social emotional skills work together. And I think those things together and broadening that definition brings us to the really important topic we want to focus on most today, is a focus on what is executive function and why is it so critical to your child developing future skills. I know executive function is a term many people have heard. The first time I've shared it with some people, they thought I was talking to them about leadership. So we've come a long way in child development of research and discussions of people understanding that term. But I think it's still pretty unclear exactly what is meant by executive function. So Stephanie, we have a few slides that are going to allow us to define and discuss executive function, but I'd like us to start by talking about why it's an important future skill.
Sure. So executive function is important because it's the neurocognitive or kind of brain basis for how we think. And it's not just what you know, so kind of knowledge, of course, is important in kind of building content and reading and math and so forth. But executive function is more about how you show what you know. It's how you think through problems. And it predicts key outcomes. So there are links between executive function and various measures of success. So certainly school readiness and school achievement is a key outcome of executive function skills, but also career success and even relationship success and having more healthy behaviors in adulthood. So it's really a holistic view of the individual being able to think through problems and make better choices for themselves that are going to be more consistent with their long-term goals.
Okay, great. That's really helpful and so interesting. I love the phrase, show what you know. I think that brings it to life. The more I've learned about executive function development in children, I'm paying more attention to how it is applied, as you discussed, in the workplace and in adult life, and frankly, how it's not applied in adult settings as well. And I really think about how important that is and how valuable the skills are if you just look at that backwards lens. So when articulating how important executive function is, I do often make that analogy of adults in a workplace meeting and thinking about all those behaviors needed to be successful. I mean, just when you're in a meeting as an adult, you can look around the room and see executive function coming to life. You're making decisions, you have to weigh options, you have to decide when to contribute, you have to connect pieces of information, new to old information, or maybe change what you know. You have to control a whole lot of impulses and so forth. So tell us more about how you define executive function.
Yeah, and so those are great. It's a great analogy, a great example of how these skills come together, and how sometimes it's painfully obvious that someone is lacking executive function skills, even adults. So, of course, these skills take a long time to develop in kids, and there are individual differences at any age, even in adults. So again, these are the neurocognitive or brain-based skills involved in helping children to control their attention, their thoughts, their emotions, and ultimately their behavior. And executive function forms the root for both social emotional and cognitive control. They both stem from these executive function skills, and we'll get more into that in a little bit. But these are essentially the skills that we use when we keep our goals in mind. So we use what's called working memory to keep goals in mind and use those goals to guide us on how to move forward. So it has less to do with what you know and more to do with having the attentional skills to use what you know in order to solve problems, to translate knowledge into behavior that's going to be consistent with your goals. Sometimes that involves resisting distractions, so resisting temptation in order to kind of stick with your goal. And sometimes it requires us to be flexible. So if a current strategy to meet a goal is not working, you need to be able to flexibly shift strategies and come up with alternative ideas. So those three skills of kind of working memory, inhibitory control, and cognitive flexibility are often thought of as the three main components of what we mean by executive function skills. And you can probably think of students or others that who are quite bright intellectually, but can't put their knowledge to use very well because other things are getting in the way. They might be highly distractible, have a short attention span, or be inflexible in how they're thinking. And so executive function is related to intelligence and sometimes correlated with IQ, but it's also dissociable or can be separated from IQ. So you might have individuals who have a high IQ but actually relatively low executive function skills.
Okay, great. That's really interesting and helpful to hear you define and describe all those characteristics. I'm thinking of examples I've seen in children and adults as you share those ideas and thoughts. I'm really wondering what our audience is thinking, and if you have any ideas, thoughts, if you're wondering anything as we're talking here, I'd love to engage you in this conversation and hear what's on your mind. If this is new to you or you're learning new ideas to add to what you already knew, which would be a little executive function for you all. Okay, so I've heard you talk about the brain as an or executive function as an air traffic controller. Can you tell us more about that analogy?
Sure. So research on understanding executive functions suggests that one helpful way to think about it is as though the executive control part of the brain is like an air traffic control at a busy airport. So you have a lot of things to keep in mind where some planes have to land and others have to take off at the same time. but there's only so much room on the ground and in the air, and this mechanism acts like an air traffic control system. So you're regulating the flow of information and focus on tasks. You have to prioritize events and avoid collisions, of course. The stakes are pretty high in that case. Keep the system flexible and running on time. You have to be able to respond to surprises or unexpected events in a flexible manner, and kind of maybe reorder things that you were going to do. So you have to tell one plane to hold off on landing because there's something on the runway, and be able to flexibly make your plans and change your plans and update them as the situation unfolds. And in children, this mechanism needs to be kind of actively geared up, and ideally as early as possible in life.
As a frequent traveler myself, I really value the real-life air traffic controllers, and this analogy helps me visualize just how important executive function is and how those skills work together. I think it's also a great segue to the core of what we're talking about, and what I think most of our audience wants to hear about is how parents can work with their children to develop executive function at home, on the go, in easy ways through their day, and then build a foundation of the skills that we've clarified are really important for future success. So can you, Stephanie, start talking a little bit about how executive function develops in the early years?
Sure. So it's a complex system-level way of thinking about it. So we focus on aspects of the individual, the environment, and then specific interactions or activities that one can do. So in terms of the individual, executive function does depend on genetics and brain development and changes in information processing, particularly in the prefrontal part of the brain, that allow for increases in reflection. So being able to reflect on or think through, pause and think through your thoughts and feelings before you act on them. In individual differences like grit, so these are sometimes called character strengths, and perseverance at maybe a long-term but difficult goal is part of executive function. It's going to draw on these executive function skills. And some individuals might, as my friend Angela Duckworth says, be grittier than others. But it's still relying on those executive function skills. So that's at the individual level. At the environmental level, we do know that the environment, things like family dynamics and school settings do influence the development of executive function skills. And as we'll discuss, there are things that we've learned that can be done to positively support these skills. But we've also learned about things in the environment that negatively impact the development of executive function skills. And primarily, I'm talking about stress. So stress is sort of the enemy of executive function. It literally interferes with the brain development and connectivity in the brain that helps support these skills. So stress, particularly chronic and toxic stress, is harmful for the development of executive function skills via brain development, and also through a lack of sometimes role models for positive executive function skills as well in a stressful or chaotic environment. And all too often, this is what might characterize a high poverty setting. So a lot of our work does focus on helping to build executive function skills in children from relatively disadvantaged backgrounds where the opportunities to practice these skills might have been lacking early in life. And then lastly, there are activities and things that you can do to specifically help build these skills. And together, we kind of think about this as like a tree of success, as just one way of summarizing what we've learned about how executive function develops.
Okay. Well, of course, I'm going to ask you, because I want to learn more, what is the tree of success?
Sure. So what we really want to help parents and other caregivers do is kind of think about this tree of success. And what you want to do is help cultivate or tend to the tree. And the roots of the tree are executive function skills. And there are two major branches for this tree. So off of this, one common trunk, there's both academic skills and social emotional skills. So as I mentioned earlier, executive function really is supporting both of those aspects of development and success in life. And we've learned that it's important, of course, that there be rich soil. And so these are kind of like first things first. So adequate nutrition as well as sleep. And sleep regulation early in development supports the development of these executive function skills. But also, every tree needs sunlight to develop, and so we can think of that as the quality caregiving. And so quality caregiving, as it pertains to executive function skills, would be warmth and sensitivity, but also helping to guide your child through challenging tasks in a way that's going to be sensitive to your child's needs and your child's pace. And we'll talk a little bit more about that so-called autonomy supportive parenting in a little bit. But every tree also, of course, needs water and rain, and so we can think about that as language input, so vocabulary, and talking to your child and giving your child more words that they can then in turn use to describe their internal thoughts and feelings, their kind of internal or inner mental life. And the more words they have to describe that to you, eventually they'll actually be able to internalize that and use those words to help guide themselves through their goals and activities. And then one thing that isn't pictured here, but we can also think about is stress, right, that I mentioned earlier. And a little bit of stress is actually good. So, the just sort of common daily stressors that challenge us and challenge our executive function skills, it'd be like sort of wind and the occasional storm that hits the tree. This actually helps the tree become stronger, helps spread the seeds, and so forth. But this sort of chronic and toxic stress that is, in a chaotic environment where there's little soothing and few opportunities to reduce stress and learn how to self-regulate, that would be kind of like a pest that is infesting the roots of the tree. And that's much more difficult to overcome that kind of stress. So that's just a summary of what we've learned about how executive function develops using this kind of tree of success analogy.
Great, that's really helpful and a really interesting analogy. I'm guessing that the listeners are envisioning real-life tree experience as I am as you explain all that. I just wanted to check in on chat. I know a couple people were asking about identifying stress and what stress looks like, and I think what you just shared about some positive stress strengthening the tree and then some chronic stress can be really negative. It was really helpful to answer that question, and then also LaDonna posted a link in chat. So, hopefully that's helpful to answer those questions about stress. There's another question that was raised that I wanted to bring up here. Someone was asking about how much of this is learned just through natural, everyday kids being themselves, how much of their executive function is developed, and versus how much intervention and support is needed from caregivers and parents.
Yeah, well, I think executive function skills, children are not born with them. They do develop and need to develop over time. And it does take a long time, actually, until their mid-20s to fully develop. So those of us, with teenagers and young adult children are very familiar with how long that takes. And, in sort of a well-supported, well-resourced, so-called typical environment where there are adequate opportunities for children to learn and practice these skills, you will see them naturally developing and improving over time. But that's not to say that they wouldn't benefit from some intentional support around building these skills. And so there are things that you can do, as we'll discuss, at any age to help build these skills. And some of them you're probably already doing and didn't even know that what you're doing is building their executive function skills.
Yeah, that will be interesting when we get to the section in a couple slides where we give some concrete ideas about what parents can do every day. I think that will be really helpful. As you're sharing this, Stephanie, it was making me think about what we do with babies who are learning to walk, and they will learn to walk whether they have an adult intervening or not. But most of the time, a baby has an adult to help hold their hand or celebrate their attempts and help them keep trying. And I think that's a good way to think about that. It will happen and it will develop with or without intervention and support, but it's richer and more meaningful and more robust when there's adult support.
That's right.
Okay, so let's kind of shift gears a little bit and start talking about a few things parents can focus on and do to support the development of children's executive function at home. I want to talk about 4 topics: autonomy, supportive parenting, learning by doing, so some activity suggestions, and then get into some conversation about reflection and mindfulness, and I know that's already come up in chat as well. So let's start with this idea of autonomy supportive parenting. I think this is also a new term that some parents are talking about, but it's probably new to many parents on the webinar today. If you subscribe to our weekly parenting newsletter, we did just do an article about autonomy supportive parenting, so you may have seen that or may be interested in that. But Stephanie, in this conversation, can you just briefly tell us what that is all about?
Sure. So autonomy supportive parenting is sometimes also called scaffolding. And so what this means is in the way in which you help your child or work with your child through a challenging task. So let's say that you're helping your child solve a puzzle, and the puzzle is in kind of what we call the zone of proximal development, to borrow a term from Vygotsky, where they can't yet do it on their own, but they can do it with support from an adult or from someone who's more competent than them at this activity. And so in that kind of interaction, what you ultimately want to do is help the child to succeed with the task, like to solve the puzzle, and to walk away from that interaction having felt like they mastered it, or that they did it, where they can actually kind of take some credit for having learned something new or achieved something or completed the task. And so the way that you interact with your child to help them walk away with that feeling, which is building their self-confidence and building their self-efficacy and kind of sense of their own importance, which is something we do want them to develop to help with these executive function skills. You need to do several things. So you need to take your child's perspective. So when you're solving this puzzle with your child, try to remember what it was like when you were their age, and be mindful of how challenging this is and how effortful it is for them, even though it's quite easy and simple for you. And also respect your child's pace. So again, you might be kind of wondering, when can we move on from this activity? I've got a million things to do. Can we hurry this along, please? Just remembering to slow down, and that it's going to take your child longer to process these things. They literally have slower speed of processing, and they're just building these connections in their brains, and the connections don't move as quickly in a child brain as they do in an adult brain. So you want to slow down and respect their pace. You also want to ensure that the child has an active role in the task. So it's really tempting to just do it yourself and kind of show them. And And modeling and kind of just demonstrating exactly how to do something is one form of instruction that children can benefit from. Children can learn by imitation, but they won't learn it as well if they are just watching you do it. And so kind of refraining from just interfering and doing it yourself, or kind of taking over, controlling the task. And then providing choices and suggestions. So instead of telling the child, oh, this piece goes here, asking more open-ended questions like, so where do you think this piece goes? Let's see, it has a little bit of the color blue on it, like the sky. What do you think? And, kind of just giving hints or subtle suggestions. If the child's looking for, where, I don't know what piece goes here, and if you do know what piece goes there, instead of just picking it up and handing it to them or just putting it in yourself, just nudge that piece within the child's field of vision, so that the next time he looks down, he sees it himself, and he thinks it's his idea all along. So those are the kinds of things that go into this scaffolding or autonomy support. And we sometimes call it Goldilocks parenting, because the secret is to not give too much support and guidance and not too little support and guidance where they're sort of flailing and not able to solve the problem on their own, but just right, kind of that just right amount of support and guidance.
Great. Okay, that's really helpful, and I'm having all sorts of visuals about how that works in real life. I bet our listeners are as well. One of the things I think about with my own children is that I am raising future adults, and that helps me keep in mind that I want them to be autonomous and be able to do these things without me there, and then I make different decisions in the moment. All the way back, they're in high school now, but I think all the way back to when they were tying their shoes or putting things away, and I had to have patience, but I had more patience when I remembered that I'm getting them ready to do this on their own. So moving us to a next part of this conversation, learning by doing is a crucial part of child's executive function building, which you were just talking about, that they do better when they learn more when they're active participants. And you said earlier in this presentation, when talking about the brain's air traffic control function, that this mechanism needs to be actively geared up as early as possible. So let's talk more about that.
Sure. So we do know that we develop our brains in particular ways by using them in particular ways. So to actually make what is at first challenging or difficult or kind of not automatic, to make that kind of, let's say, the right thing. So like sharing, sharing a toy with a peer is sort of the right thing to do, but it's not the natural thing to do at first, as we know. And but the more practice the child gets with this act of sharing, the easier it becomes. And again, it's not enough to abstractly know something. So you could, tell the child till you're blue in the face, oh, remember, we have to share, we have to share, we have to share. They know that, but they can't yet do it on their own until they've had sufficient practice in doing that. So again, it's, learning by doing, and you have to sort of train up by practicing these skills. And I mean, if you wouldn't want someone to perform, surgery on you or a family member who said, oh, I can do this, I read about how to do it. You would want someone who's actually trained for years and years about how to do that. So it's the same kind of idea here. Okay, great.
I'm really looking forward to taking these ideas we're talking about with autonomous supported parenting and learning by doing and thinking about executive function and sharing some real practical ways that parents can work on these things in day to day. So let's talk about the age groups and give some suggestions. starting with those little ones. It's hard to believe that executive function is for babies too, but it is. So, Stephanie, can you just share a couple suggestions you have for starting to support executive function with babies?
Sure. So the first thing that we can suggest is to talk to your baby. Sometimes you might hear from your great grandmother, oh, babies, they can't talk yet, and so there's no point in talking to them. Well, it couldn't be farther from the truth. When infants hear more words, they learn more words, and this is going to be beneficial for later executive function growth. Again, it's kind of like what we're trying to cultivate here is this inner verbal monologue. And if you think through how you as an adult pursue your goals throughout the day, you talk to yourself. It might even be out loud sometimes, but at least inwardly you're kind of talking yourself through your goals and through resisting distractions and through that kind of mental flexibility. And so the more words infants hear, the better equipped they'll be to develop that inner monologue as they grow. You also want to develop consistent routines for things that happen every day, like eating and bath time and bedtime, because when babies get used to routines, they can form expectations about what will happen next. So this makes it easier for them to stay regulated if they kind of have an idea of what's going to happen next. On the other hand, you don't want everything to be just a routine without any new or novel experiences, because giving children exposure to new experiences in moderation will also stretch them. So take your baby to new places like the post office, check out new books from the library, or let your baby explore new objects, because the brains really grow when they get to try new things. Again, sort of within a safe and comforting environment. And in the context of a healthy social relationship with a caregiver. You can also read books to your baby. So again, even though they can't understand everything that you're saying, reading does give them some of this vocabulary growth, and it gives them a longer attention span too. So you can try building longer and longer picture books into their repertoire so that they develop a longer attention span. So these are just a variety of techniques. You can also do imitation games. They love hiding games like peekaboo and finger plays, and even just a little bit of turn taking and role play, like first I hide this object, and now it's going to be your turn to hide this object. All of those things are going to be building these skills.
It really is amazing how simple but intentional experiences can influence important development, and how much those little babies are growing and developing even before they're verbal. There was a question in chat about how do you scaffold activities for an infant? How do you know they're ready for scaffolding if they can't verbalize? What would you say to that, Stephanie?
I would say, be sensitive to what your baby's telling you, even though your baby can't talk. So, if they start to grimace and turn away, turn their head away from an activity, that's a sign that, okay, this is a little bit too much. So, being sensitive to those kinds of cues about not, challenging them, but knowing when to pull back. And learning how to kind of read their mood, letting them explore, with curiosity, but that's going to grow with time. And so, at first, when you present them with a new object, they might seem disinterested. But if you try with that same object again, just a week or two later, you might find that they are really interested in it, because they've just developed, more to the point where they can start to want to explore that object.
Yeah, those are great cues, and when you're taking the time and being a little bit more flexible with length of time and really cueing into those nonverbal messages children are sending at those young age. I think parents will really pick up on those things. So
right.
let's think about the next phase, which gets a lot busier, those little toddlers. What are some ideas you have for toddlers?
Yeah, so I mean, one of the main themes that we're all well aware of with toddlers is independence. So they're starting to want more independence and need more independence, yet they're not, they're still, they know just enough to be dangerous, kind of. So they still do require a lot of limit setting. So this, is part of why this is such a tricky age and stage in development. But you can encourage their exploration. So, again, they learn by doing and experiencing. And you can give them hands-on experiences in a variety of different settings. Going to, if you've done a trip to the zoo, that would be maybe a new activity, and then coming home and having some zoo, some toy zoo animals. So that they can kind of reenact that and make animal sounds and remember what they saw and plan maybe even a little scenario with the farm animals. So just picking up on their curiosity and letting them take it the next step further with your support. There are also games that encourage children to use these working memory skills to improve their attention span and practice blocking out distractions or interference. So, for example, freeze game is great for developing these executive function skills. And the freeze game is like musical chairs, where you play music and then the music stops. But instead of sitting, in these chairs when the music ends, you tell your toddler to freeze. And so they need to start listening for the cue of, when the music stops, that's when I freeze and I have to, stop my body from moving. This helps develop their impulse control skills. You can also let your child help you with chores. So again, they want to develop these independent skills, and they love to start acting like adults. So if you give your child small jobs, like putting silverware on the table, this feels very adult for them, and they get to take responsibility in carrying out the task. Just don't hold them to doing it perfectly. But it helps them, learn to plan and persist in the task and, feel successful. You can also, keep in mind that you have to be consistent in the limits that you set for your child. So first, you want to make your expectations realistic, given your child's age. So, for example, young children simply can't remember as many rules as older children at once. So you need to kind of tailor it to what they can do with their current stage and rate of brain development. Then when you make a rule, you can try to enforce the rule every time it comes up. So having clear limits helps them know what they can and can't do, and therefore control their own behavior to meet those expectations over time.
Great. Yeah, at Bright Horizons, we often refer to children as busy little scientists, and I think this is the most true for this age. So I appreciate how these activities fit right into that unique stage of life. I'm seeing a couple of chat questions. Some of them are fairly complex, so if we have time at the end, we will get to those. But I just wanted to acknowledge that there's people asking about mindfulness and meditation, and we are going to get to that in a few slides. So I just wanted to let people know that. But before we get there, let's talk about preschoolers and executive function. What are your ideas for them?
So yeah, preschoolers, this is like the golden age of executive function development, where you really see it take off from about age 3 to 5. This is the golden age of kids really developing these skills. And in fact, it's kind of even hard to keep up with them from day to day because they're growing so fast during this time period. But things that you can do is encourage your preschooler to be creative and implement their own ideas. So for instance, you could say your preschooler wants to make a fort in the living room. So you could help them determine, what kind of supplies do you think we need to build a fort? And, show them some helpful construction techniques, but again, let them take some independence with it. So they're going to have to, in doing something like that, it requires them to plan ahead and then follow through on the plan. And another thing that you can do is, keep them active and get moving. So when children are physically active, their hearts get pumping and their brains are actually getting more blood flow. And there's some evidence that, aerobic activity does help build the brain and executive function skills. You could do this by, going for walks, going to the park, have a dance party in your living room. Things to kind of keep kids moving is going to be helpful as well. And it's even more helpful if whatever the game is has a rule to it, or has rules that they have to keep in mind. So you could make it a dance party that has, certain rules, or, again, that freeze dance game can be a lot of fun for kids this age. There are also games that probably you and I played when we were in the early grades that are building executive function skills, and we just didn't even realize it. So red light, green light is a classic where you have to go and stop according to a cue, a red light or a green light or a red light. Mother May I is another example of that kind of a game, or Simon Says. And the bingo song is also a great one because it requires your child to pay close attention and also inhibit an impulsive movement. So you have to remember, as you sound out the bingo song to, oh, we already said B, so, now we need to clap for the B and just say the other letters and so forth. It requires them to remember that. You could also have them introduce people, if it's in a peer, you have a couple of friends over, or it's a birthday party in a circle, you could have them kind of introduce each person, and you add a name each time you go around. So, my name is Stephanie, and I see that we've already met so and 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 so, and the names get longer, and the number of people that they have to remember gets longer. You want to keep these things challenging and keep the challenge level going up as children age and as their skills in this area develop. Because if the game, whatever it is no longer challenging, then they won't be exercising and stretching and developing these executive function skills. Because at that point, that means that's become an automatic behavior, and it's no longer conscious or effortful. So keeping it challenging will keep it conscious and effortful. And then lastly, one of my favorite activities for preschoolers is pretend play and imagination games. So they love role play and pretending to be somebody else at this age, and that's a great vehicle for thinking outside the box and imagining things from somebody else's perspective. And when they do that, they're really reflecting on how the world, I wonder how this would feel from somebody else's perspective, or what does it feel like to be the mommy versus the baby? Those are really good ways to build this cognitive flexibility part of executive function.
Great. Yes, I see that a lot in our centers, and we focus on imaginary play and dramatic play as a priority. So it's fun to see children taking on those roles, and you see executive function being used and developed all the time. It's fun to hear you talk about some of these, what I guess we could consider retro games, being so valuable for children these days. And I hope it's a nice reminder to parents that these are just some really simple ways that children, whether they're with you or at school or other caregivers, doesn't require a lot of fancy equipment or material to do these things, just you and a child, or a teacher and a child, and you can help support their executive function. I know that's so important for working parents on the webinar today. We have a question in chat that I thought we could think about for a moment, Stephanie, about if children have a really busy schedule. I guess this is kind of a two-part question. If children have a really busy schedule, and going from thing to thing all day, how does that affect executive function development? And then how valuable is a parent supporting executive function if they're only with their child for a small portion of that busy day?
Yeah, that's a really good and relevant question, I think, for everyone on the webinar today. So the opportunities to, exposure and opportunities to practice these skills is going to be kind of the most important thing, and that can happen in a variety of settings. So, of course, high quality early care and education, like at Bright Horizons, with so-called quality time at home as well. There's some evidence that busier is not necessarily better in terms of child activities. So I think children, do need time and opportunity for reflection as much as, they do for kind of keeping, moving to the next thing throughout the day. There, some correlational evidence that kids who are more scheduled actually have lower executive function skills, so-called overscheduling. It is correlational, but it suggests that, overscheduling could actually be negative for the development of these skills. I think building in time for reflection is really important as well.
Great. Well, and that's actually the next thing I wanted to talk to you about is reflection. So tell us more about what is valuable about building in reflection and why that's important.
Yeah, so reflection changes one's perspective on a situation, and we call this psychological distance from a situation. So if you're in a challenging situation or a tempting situation, or even just a boring situation where you need to kind of persevere to get through it, it's helpful if you can kind of just take a step back and look at the situation almost like from a bird's eye view or a third person perspective. And what that does is it gives you a chance to think about, the range of possible responses or possible choices that you have and to select among them. Another example would be if you're kind of having an argument with somebody, and if, let's say a child is having an argument with a sibling, if you could give them an opportunity and some strategies to actually pause and step back from the situation, then they might see more clearly that, hitting the sibling is just one option of many, and that there could be better options. This kind of short circuits that like reflex, knee-jerk, impulsive response of doing the first thing that comes to mind, which might be to hit your sibling, and instead gives you the opportunity to reflect on, oh, wait, I have a choice. I have a choice in how to act in this situation, how to respond to this situation. And once you realize that you have a choice in how to act, think, or feel, then you have more control over how you act, think, and feel, because now it's coming from a more considered and sort of prudent perspective. That's going to be more. You're going to think to yourself, well, what's the most what's going to be most consistent with my goal? And maybe the most consistent, my goal is to have a turn with the iPad. And if that's the goal, a better way to get there would be to kind of go to mom or talk through this problem versus hitting my sibling. So that's just kind of an example of how stepping back from the situation can enable you to act more in concert with your goals using these reflection and executive function skills.
Yeah, I think, even thinking about adults and how they learn and interact, I can't emphasize how valuable reflection is. Just think if all children develop those skills, how many arguments or misunderstandings or challenges would be saved. It's kind of the adult equivalent of walking away from an email that you're upset about and giving yourself time to think about it before you respond. In our last 5 minutes here, I really want to make sure that we get to talk about mindfulness, and there's a lot of questions about that. So let's transition into some ideas for how to practice mindfulness with young children. What are your thoughts?
Sure. So even very young children can engage in some mindfulness activities. And so what mindfulness is sort of you can think of it as the first step in a way of that reflection process that I just talked about. Because mindfulness enables you to tune in to what you're feeling subjectively and become more aware of that and more attentive to what you're feeling. So then you could think through your options and subsequently come to a better decision about how to act in light of that situation. So some things that you can do even with toddlers and preschoolers is belly breathing. So where you take deep breaths and have the abdomen kind of rise and fall with deep breaths can really help you tune in to your body and to your feelings. And a fun way to do that with young kids is to have them have a stuffed animal on their belly that they and their job is to rock the stuffed animal to sleep, and they can do that by watching their belly rise and fall with these deep breaths. Another activity that we do with preschoolers is ring a bell and listen to it fade and have them raise their hand when they can no longer hear the bell. So it just requires you to really pause and focus your attention and think through, kind of reflect on that situation. And then if you do it in a group, you can actually see that kids raise their hands at different times. And that gives you some insight into, that was different for him or her than it was for me. So that can help with things like empathy development. And then a last activity that I can suggest for this age group is to take a hula hoop and have your child stand in the middle of a hula hoop and then have them raise it up and kind of do a body scan where they're asked to think about that body part. So if the hula hoop is over their shoulders, they're supposed to just think about your shoulders and how do your shoulders feel, and do they feel tense and all scrunchy and tight, or do they feel calm and relaxed? And so those are some things that kids actually really enjoy doing that can help build these skills.
Great. I think about, as you're talking, I think about how valuable these activities would be, and even for adults sometimes. So adults should do these with their children, and you think about how they can be used anytime in practice, but then really handy to have available when children are struggling in the moment. Unfortunately, we're at the end of our time of the webinar. I could talk about this topic for hours, and as much as I read and think about this topic, I always learn from a discussion with you, so I really appreciate this time with you. I know at Bright Horizons we want to leave you parents that are participating today with a couple of closing points. So I just want to emphasize that future skills go beyond those traditional academic skills and include things like creativity, empathy, collaboration, critical thinking, and executive function. Executive function is a key player in building the foundation for your child's future success in school, work, and life. It's the mind's air traffic controller, and brain-based skills involve helping control attention, thoughts, emotion, and behavior. And I think most importantly, it's really easy to support as a parent with easy activities and practices you can do at home and fit into just your regular daily schedules and teachable moments that you find throughout your day or week. So with that, Stephanie, again, thank you so much, and I appreciate the time learning from you today, and I will turn things back over to LaDonna.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rachel.
Oh, thank you, Stephanie, and
thank you all.
Rachel, and thanks to everyone on the webinar today for participating. You guys asked a lot of really great questions, lots of really great feedback for us. So I'll just take you through a couple of quick closing slides, and then we'll let you guys get back on with your day. So before you close from the webinar, we definitely want to encourage you to check out the webinar resources. A lot of the questions or ideas that you guys were sharing in the chat You'll find a lot of resources in some of the articles we posted for you, but if you don't have time to grab the webinars, don't worry, we will send you a webinar. We'll send you an email with the webinar recording, the links, as well as a link to Rachel's podcast. And then, of course, if you have a minute, if you could please take our survey. We read every answer, so we would appreciate hearing from you. And just want to say thank you again for participating. Have a great day.